Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. Welcome to our Racism Across Diaspora and Personal Narratives live discussion panel. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe and like, as we really appreciate it. Any type of support to our channel. I would just like to give a short introduction about our organization of Air Dialogue. Air Dialogue was established in Dublin in 2010 and is a sister charity of Dialogue Society to advance social cohesion by connecting communities, empowering people to engage and contribute to the development of ideas on dialogue and community building. Air Dialogue aims to facilitate dialogue on a whole range of social issues regardless of any particular faith or religion. We stand for democracy, human rights, the non-instrumentalization of religion in politics, equality, and freedom of speech. In today's panel, our goal is to raise awareness of racism in Ireland through personal stories, and we hope our speakers will bring a better understanding of inequality experienced by Irish residents. Overall, we would like to provoke conversations that matter. The past discussions within the series have focused on the analysis of racial politics and proactive approaches towards the goal of racial equality. This month's discussion intends to take a less clinical approach and instead hold space for personal narratives. Through a conversation on lived experiences of our speakers, this panel intends to shine a personal light on the racism that pervades lives, as well as the groundwork for a comparative case study. By highlighting their own relationship to race and racial politics, our esteemed speakers will trace the trajectory of how racial policies and the racial history of their representative countries has affected them on a personal level. They will outline some of the deep-seated racial issues in their countries and suggest steps to decision makers that we could take to address these issues. In today's panel, I would like to give a warm welcome and introduce our speakers. First, we have Sandraine, who is a tutor and PhD candidate at the University of Limerick. Then we have Teresa, who is an integration manager, Immigrant Council of Ireland, and Dr. Thamel, who is the teaching associate, University of Nottingham, critical international law scholar. I would like to also introduce Denga, who is the trainee company secretarial executive, William Fry's master degree at University of Ulster, and Lasane, who is the chairperson at Africa Centre Ireland. Dr. Thamel, I'm very happy to have you on board. The stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Zeba, and to every one involved in Air Dialogue. As already introduced, my name is Tamil. You might see the screen and you think to yourself, this guy looks very brown and very Indian. As a matter of fact, my parents are from Sri Lanka, but you guessed wrong. I am German, pure as nature. So I was born and raised in Germany, received my legal education there, and then also in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and then later on in Ireland, in the most beautiful county of Ireland, namely the Galway, where I did my PhD at the Irish Centre for Human Rights. So, I mean, it's very important what was mentioned by Zeba earlier to talk about lived realities that are informed by racial histories or racialized histories. I mean, I met my share deal of racism in many regards. Subtle racism in Germany, not so much in Netherlands, but definitely in Ireland, where it became very prevalent in many regards. I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes maximum before leaving the floor to my learned colleagues there on the panel. Some of you who are listening and watching this, Sri Lanka is a country, for example, that has seen a lot of racial and religious discrimination in this post-colonial era. Racial discrimination against the Tamils, which are the minority on the island. The majority are the Sinhalese, and they led religious and ethnicity-based discrimination against the Tamils. The Tamils, until today, without going into the details of that conflict, are just deserving dignity. And I think that is something that many people who are living in majority communities in the West are also deserving. When we look at anti-Asian hate against the background of COVID-19 and the hate that is spewed against them in the US, but also in front of our own house door, if you think of the hate the hate crime that was committed against a member of our society on Henry Street a couple of days ago, it is about othering. It is about declassifying somebody and devaluing her individual nature on planet Earth and in the society. So I think our own racial histories are informing that particular racial and lived realities that we are having in this country when we speak about Ireland, and that it should change, namely in something that I would call, as my father would always say, in a society that should be informed by e pluribus unum, the American logo, which means out of many, one. And I think that is something that Ireland should strive for, and something that we should always work for, because our different narratives can make a better society, which is multicultural, multi-plural, and working towards a society that works for all and not for few. That is something I would say at this very stage, and that I'm happy to elaborate later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tama. I really do think that's what you said is very eye-opening, and I do agree. The fact that we all come from different backgrounds and we can use our voice to talk, and how we can discuss of how we can prevent these type of incidents from happening, and what we can do to go past history and go past what's happening around the world. Thank you very much. Next, I would really love to hand the stage over to Teresa. Teresa, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ziba. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Teresa Buczkowska, and I'm a migrant woman living in Ireland. I'm from Poland, and that is indicating maybe the fact that as a Polish woman, white Polish woman in Ireland, I haven't really experienced that much racism as other people, because we all experiencing racism in different ways. As a white woman, I can hide behind my white skin, but the moment I open my mouth and my strong Eastern European accent comes out, people know that I'm a migrant, and that's usually when discrimination happens. But I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about stories that we are sharing, and how we are sharing, and how those stories are being used in public debate by other forces to talk about racism. I work as the integration manager at the Immigrant Council of Ireland, and quite often we are getting requests from journalists and other stakeholders to provide personal stories of people for conferences, interviews, and so on. And I kind of see this as a further marginalization and exploitation of people's stories for the benefits of the public. Usually what happens, people of minority background are invited to public spaces to talk about issues that directly affect them, but they are invited there to talk from the perspective of a victim. Whereas we are professionals experienced in many fields, and we are more than just our stories. We can talk about many, many other issues. But even when we're talking about racism, we can talk about our story, and then we can also talk about solutions. And that's what I would like to see, the change in how members of ethnic minorities are being projected through personal stories. Personal story is very personal to us, but when that personal story doesn't connect to the power narrative and narrative that is talking about resilience, solutions, policies, legal aspects, then that story is being exploited. And that's why I'm very much opposed to to this kind of way of exploiting people's narrative and trying to tackle that in the public domain. And I always talk about, whenever people are inviting other people to conferences, I always ask them, asking them to ask the questions. Are you inviting that person to talk from a perspective of a victim or from a perspective of a power and resilience? And that is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I think you made some very beautiful points there. How you mentioned how we shouldn't be afraid, really, to speak up and ask questions. And again, just we should use our voices as we are stronger together. So thank you for your contribution. I really appreciate it. Next, I would really want to give a warm welcome to Sandrine. Sandrine, stage is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and for the other speakers who went before me. So for me, it's like when I was looking at this topic, I kind of look at it from the perspective of education, because like I am a PhD researcher in contemporary African literature. So a lot of the post-colonial theories like really inform the way I deal with racism in Ireland. So like I would, originally I'm from Rwanda, but would have lived in Kenya for 5 years. Then that's where I would have learned English, again, out of colonialism, and then moved to Ireland when I was 10. And for me with racism, like it's not something that I experienced until like moving to Ireland. Like obviously I knew that there was Black and white people and other different shades of colors, but it wasn't until like coming to Ireland and experiencing that firsthand about like being made feel inferior just on the basis of your skin. And again, it's things that I continuously experienced the older I got. And I think with that, it always went back to when I would claim Irish spaces of being Black and Irish. I think there was a very huge resistance when it comes to that dual identity. And it's something that is still prevalent now, like even with being a second generation migrant, like I have little brothers who were born in Ireland, and even then, just on the mere basis of them having Black skin, they can't afford to be called Irish. So that's the one thing that I've really noticed in Ireland. It's when outside voices or other voices are trying to claim space that have been predominantly set out and continuously benefit white people, then that's where there's like a raise there. And when like I'm thinking of like racial history, like again, it just goes back to my studies with colonialism and that sense of stereotype that's always projected onto people that occupy the Black body in a predominantly white space. And that's something that it's still there now. So like the most prominent question that I always keep getting asked is always like, where are you from? Because again, it's just because I have Black skin, even if I'm like Carlo, like I've lived in Carlo, like Ireland is all that I know, it still will never be enough because of that. And I think like when trying to think of things about moving forward is by just by adding in word literature and kind of moving away from viewing like Western thoughts and Western thinking as default, because I think that really informs how we view racism in Ireland. Because like it's 2021 and we're still debating whether or not it exists in Ireland. Like it exists, simple as, like we need to move forward. But people will only know that by engaging in, again, just because I come from a literature perspective, through the form of literature where you're exposed to post-colonial theories where they're telling you like about like what it's like having a black or brown body after colonialism and trying to find that identity and again like embracing that dual identity. We've seen that all around Europe, and again like I think a prominent example I can think of is when France won the World Cup and the comedian Trevor Noah say that it was actually Africa who won it because again the majority of the team were black, and then straight away it was like no, they're French, but only because they were doing something good, but like when they were doing something bad, no, they're black or they're African. So that's something that again, that sense of duality where it can be taken away at any moment but then praised where you're doing something good, that's something that we really need to depart from, because we've seen it like Ireland is very multicultural and it's very diverse, and again like there's just no, we need to depart from viewing Irishness in like in a monolithic sense where it's like to be Irish only means to be white, heterosexual and Catholic. Like that's, we've debunked that, like even with the panel here now we've all debunked that. So like just that's like a way forward to really look at again just incorporating different world literature or anything like that, to start looking at new ways of viewing Irish identity, because that's where a lot of racism is really stemmed from.
Wow, Sandrine. I was really captivated, really, because I can also relate to you. I have two younger twin sisters. They're born and raised here, but they always presume that we're from India, and even though they were born and raised here, they never really acknowledge the fact that they're actually Irish just because of the skin. So there are some barriers there that we need to really lift. So thank you very much for your contribution. If any of you have any comments to make on what each other said, feel free.
If I may, Seva?
If anyone has any comments to make if anyone has any comments, really, you can feel free to just comment now.
If I may?
Yeah.
Yeah, Seva. So I found Theresa made some very valuable points there, that we need to turn or shift from the notion of victimhood to an own agency. Obviously, I think our contributions to the society and how we have made ourselves aware of who we are in this very society is giving us our own agency and our own dignity that derives from it. I think that was quite interesting. But on this note, I mean, and adding to what Theresa said, I mean, she comes from my neighboring country, namely Poland, right? I hold the Polish in highest regards in many respects. They gave us their best football players. Thankfully, thanks. Podolski and Klose. But however, when I started my new position in Nottingham, I took the taxi to the house of my cousin, and the driver of the car was British, but of Bangladeshi descent, and all of a sudden we talked about Brexit. And I, started to talk about, oh, listen, the Polish people in Britain, they have contributed so much. And he said something that struck me. And when Theresa was talking, I had to think about it. He said to me, well, the Polish, I'm not generalizing. That's the standard sentence. But they're slicky characters. And I said, well, is it okay to generalize like that? And he said, well, they come and take our jobs. And immediately I had to think of a very important sentence that Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, a very famous geographer. She said, capitalism depends and thrives on inequalities. Racism enshrines it. And I think that was a very important point. There was one minority community, one BAME community against another community, which is played out against each other because capitalism wants us to fight against each other. We are still hustling for the same value, namely wealth, but we are played out against each other because we are different and we are still fighting for the same cake, okay? In the illusion that we are getting the same cake with all its juiciness. That's one thing I wanted to mention to or comment on regarding Theresa. I mean, it was interesting what Sandrine said there. I belong to a scholarship which is called the Third World Approaches International Law, and we believe, TWAIL is our abbreviation, TWAIL. We believe that international law as it stands is reproducing colonial inequalities through the contemporary colonial architecture, in form even of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, and many other organizations. And she made very important points there. And I think immediately of great writers who have navigated us through post-coloniality, namely Aimé Césaire or Frantz Fanon, who have said that our bodies, our minds are used as torturing vehicles for the white man. Which brings me to Ireland. I mean, I've lived now in this country for 8 years, and I appreciate and love this country. As a matter of fact, I just, I'm in the preparation to submit my Irish citizenship application. And the reason why I'm applying for the Irish citizenship is out of one dominant reason, namely, Ireland has a shared history in suffering. Ireland has as much suffering as the Tamils had under the colonial subjugation. 800 years of subjugation unites us in suffering, and that particular narrative of historical oppression is somewhat, translating in our interrelatedness. However, we've seen in the recent times a great deal of racism, of othering, and Sandrine mentioned, and with 2 or 3 sentences, I will finish my comments. I don't want to be one of these professors who keep on talking, right? The thing is, Sandra made a very good sentence about this question about where you're from. I've heard 2 more sentences, namely, why this is what happened in Germany to me. They said to me, why do you speak this good German? Well, I said, well, look, I'm German. It's one of my mother tongues. Of course I speak good German. I speak better German than you. And the third sentence I've ever heard, and this was the most hurtful sentence I've heard, was, when do you go back? And I said, why should I go back? I was born in Westphalia. I am from Bonn. There is no place I should go back. I belong here, right? So the question about belonging, right? If you have contributed, if you have lived here, if you were born here, you belong here. And with this, let me finish, and then, probably I will jump in at some other stage.
Wow, thank you very much for your contribution to the conversation there, Dr. Thamel. Highly appreciated. If anyone else has any other comments they would like to make, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on, again, just with what Dr. Thamel said with regards to how people who, within the 2 different groups are, within the oppressed groups, are fighting against each other as well. And I think that's something that is so prevalent in Ireland, just because racism, it's always been there. As I say, I've been here for 15 years and it's always been a part of it, but it wasn't until last year when we started to really talk about it, and we kind of stopped using the US as a scapegoat, because before, when something racist would happen, it'd be oh, it's not as bad as it is in the US, or sure, the Irish were colonized too, and I'm yeah, but that stopped. So then we didn't have that. So last year we were very confronted with it, just in the rise of Black Lives Matter, where you saw protests happening in Ireland, and you saw the government being please stay indoors and stuff like that. But then that's where, again, it kind of brought about how, within that 2 sentences of how we've seen 2 pandemics, COVID and racism, and they go hand in hand together. And it was the first time that in Ireland, where we started having really difficult conversations. But the main thing that I've noticed, where again there's still this false sentiment that racism is only something that happens between Black and white bodies. I say this in the sense of within Ireland, like Irish travelers, like they're left out of conversations to do with racism, and they are discriminated against every single day. Like there's reports and reports and reports, yet even like when we're talking on like in regards to racism or different panels, like they're not invited, because again, it's still that false sense that racism only happens between Black and white. But like I always say it, like with because I tutor sociology, and I'm like, if you look up the definition, it's just again like that conquest of power, like inferiority versus superiority, but like there's no color in it. So like, why is it that we're still only including certain people there? And I think that's where, like what Teresa said, like the fact that some people like with migrants, like they receive racism, yet people diminish that just because they're white. But then it's like, you can still actually say, like speaking, you can tell like, okay, that's another, and straight away you're discriminated against. So we're still able to see that, and where we really need to move away from that again. But that's just because any form of racism or racism ideologies or thoughts, like they're all Americans. We haven't in Ireland, we haven't really developed like a racial consciousness and to like just understand how to talk about racism and how to include migrants, how to include travelers, how to include Asians, how to include anyone else that isn't Black. You know, like it has to move beyond that. And I think that's where just people don't understand it. And that's where straight away, like when you do call someone out of being racist, that they're just like, well, I can't be because like I have a Pakistani neighbor or I have a Black friend, without understanding that you do have racial biases. And just because you're saying that, like that doesn't mean it's real. Like, because like I tweeted before where I was like, you can't have Black Lives Matter on your Twitter and yet hate Polish people, hate travelers, and hate other people. Like you just can't be like, okay, I'm not racist because I like Black people, then everyone else is another. So that's something that, and that just goes to like just the simple definition of what racism is, and moving beyond that and just educating yourself to understand what that means.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Sandrine said there, because I do lots of training on intercultural competency and unconscious biases and anti-racism. And from my experience is that people who are coming to this training, they have very limited understanding what racism is. Usually people understand racism in terms of this, hardcore division, segregation that happened in South Africa or in the southern states of US, where people couldn't use the same buses and they couldn't go to the same schools. And obviously we don't have that in Ireland, but they don't really understand that it's all about power dynamics. It's all about access to resources. It's about microaggressions. That there is, racism has variety of ways to be implemented in life. And racism is not static, because as a white woman, I experience racism, but also as a white woman who is a product of a society. I was born and raised in Poland. When I look at the curriculum in school that I had, I'm really surprised how come I never come out of that education system more racist that I am, sometimes, because it's so deeply embedded in us that even if I am an anti-racist activist, sometimes, whether I want it or not, there will be moments where I might unconsciously act on my racist sentiments that were embedded in me. So that's why I have to be very careful with the way how I really relate to other people in different circumstances. And racism is not only about color, because let's look at Priti Patel in UK. She's a woman of an Indian heritage. Her parents were migrants, and her politics is highly anti-migrant, and her politics are highly racist. So racism isn't really a strict division between people of different color. It's about how we are diminishing one group of people to elevate another group of people. And I think the problem what Sandrine actually mentioned with the way how we understand racism is that we are copying scholars from US. And the way how racism been experienced in US, it's slightly different than in Europe. And it's even slightly different than it was experienced in South Africa. I had the opportunity of learning about racism from activists both in US and South Africa. All of them speak about those issues in a different way. And yet none of those theories that they are using and those narratives that they are using can be 100% implemented in Ireland. We have to develop our own understanding and speaking about racism to grasp the diversity of experiences that we have in Ireland with the indigenous traveling community, with Eastern European migrants, with Black and Irish people, and people coming from Africa or Southeast Asia or other countries. There is a multicultural sort of component to that hasn't been yet that well documented and researched.
I do agree with you, Teresa. I do think that we have to be more accepting, and we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other countries. We shouldn't be putting it as a like a step, like a ladder. Really, we shouldn't be putting it that, oh, this country's doing it, so we're okay. We have to really face reality, and we have to just be honest with ourselves and be open to discussion and different ideas. So thank you very much for your contribution there. If anyone has any other final comments to make, please feel free to go ahead.
If I may, I mean, sorry, I don't want to be is it the right term now to use mansplaining? No, I'm not mansplaining. I'm just, just approving and supporting and highlighting what Sandrine and Teresa said. I immediately, when Sandrine said, this example of the Pakistani a neighbor, I have a Pakistani neighbor, I cannot be racist. I immediately had to think of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of the Front National, who the xenophobic racist party in France. And when he was asked, "Are you racist?" He said, "Well, no, I'm not racist. I have an African gardener." Which, that was like 20 years ago when I heard that sentence of him. And he didn't even, smile or anything. He was purely honest about it. So this is, the mindset that people have, if you have someone that that gives you like the carte blanche, the white card to hate and instigate against each other. Theresa made a very good point about the racism that is played against different minorities, and also then mentioning Priti Patel. I mean, I'm looking at Dun Laoghaire right now and looking at the Irish Sea, but I fall within the UK jurisdiction, working also for Nottingham now. But I'm quite outspoken when I speak about Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak. For me, they are, like many other politicians from the right in particular, token politicians who are speaking for particular legislations and particular legislative frameworks that are suiting ideologies. And Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak and many others of them are just suiting that narrative of working in favor of white hegemony in order to sustain their own positions. That is my personal opinion. I'm very frank. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said, I'm German. So as a German, I'm very frank and very open and direct. But I wanted to mention another point, if I may, namely that issue, and this was something that I wanted to bring into the discussion, namely of gaslighting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term. I just rather recently came across with the term of gaslighting, which I found very interesting, namely gaslighting used against women who face domestic violence or emotional abuse, but it's now extended also to communities who are faced with racism, namely gaslighting as a terminology to explain that people's own narratives and experiences are downplayed. Right? So, we are told, your racist experience is not that bad. Okay. And I think Sandrine and Teresa touched upon it in different regards. Because Ireland, I mean, being a country that faced colonialism, yes, okay, you know, and I do appreciate that there are certain narratives that are uniting us, but we have seen over the last 2-3 years, and I've noticed it rather in the background of Brexit, that this became even more prevalent, that our narratives are downplayed. You know, we are told it's not that bad that you're faced. It's not that bad. Not all of us are that like that, because how can we be racist if we have faced racism ourselves in the UK or in the US, right? So our minds are, at the end of the day, speaking with Frantz Fanon, colonized again. In a matter of fact, we are gentrified. Our minds are gentrified in order to suit a white hegemonic discourse, and we are told to adapt to what they want. Okay, so that is something that I wanted to raise as well, and we should be very adamant. And you know, the last 2-3 days, I was watching the court case of George Floyd that actually triggered this whole racial discourse. I mean, this tragic death of this man has triggered this discourse, and if we are facing, and I'm not sure if you're watching it, I'm as a legal academic, I'm watching the court case. If you watch the court case, you think to yourself, if George Floyd is on trial, or rather Chauvin, the man who killed him, okay, it is us who is again the victim. This brings me back to Theresa's point from earlier. We are the victims, but we are also the ones who contributed to victimhood and being the perpetrators of this victimhood. So it's a very complex situation that we are in, and we have to overcome these racialized entanglements through resistance. Resistance in law and politics, but also societal, intercultural, and cross-cultural interactions. So that is from me. Thanks very much.
If I can just touch on that, yeah, no, I thought that was like a brilliant point, because I think it's something that I found anyway, just as being like a Black and Irish person, whenever I would see any form of racism happening in the US, I've found that I'm like, okay, at least it's not happening like that in Ireland. And like, you're right though, like that is a form of that colonialism there, like, and being colonized, because it is like where, when we talk about like racism in Ireland, I remember I was in a group and I was talking to Americans and they didn't even know that Black and Irish people exist. I was like, yeah, that happens, and trying to tell them like how there is racism here in Ireland. But then it was like, okay, what different forms of racism are there? And then I was like, well, mainly it's just microaggression, but like it gets so bad that again we just become so desensitized to it that again, like, where are you from question is just like a part of your name, where like the moment I introduce myself, I'm like, I have to be like, yeah, born here, but live in Ireland, like just like a part of my ID, because I've just heard that question over and over again. And like the main thing, it's always like, yeah, like we experience microaggression, but like at least we don't have police brutality. But like I'm still experiencing racism, and so are other people, but we're still we've kind of been rationalized and, as you say, to like colonize in that sense, to just be like, okay, our form of racism isn't bad, even though we're still being traumatized by that, and it's still something that is impacting how we relate to Irishness. We're still able to like distinguish that, just because I can walk by and I won't be scared of the guards or anything like that, which is still very wrong. But I think that that's the whole point of it. And I think that's why, like, with that point you made, it was like, that is the whole point of it. Because whenever, I remember last year, like even when I started talking about racism, and I co-produced a documentary called On Silencing Black Voices, where we were talking with Black and Irish people about racism, and like even the comments we were getting was like, but if you don't like it, go, or like, sure, it's not as bad, or it only happened once. And like our whole documentary, we did it through different fragmentations of showing it being like, it happens in primary school, that you think, okay, kids will be kids, they'll grow up, you go to college, you go to workplace, it's still there. Like I still get it now as a PhD student. Anytime I talk, you're so articulate, because again, like just imagining a Black educated woman is just far reach there. But again, like by saying it, it's like, but at least you feel safe in Ireland, it's not as bad as the US. And I think that's definitely like the most perfect form of gaslighting. And that's why, again, people get so offended when you call them racist, because it's still like, but we were once colonized as well. And I think it goes back to like how in the past, again, during the famine and anything like that, there was those posters when Irishmen and Black men were all depicted like chimpanzee, and it was like no Irish, no dogs, and no Blacks. So we did have that shared sense of community, but again, that has departed, and that's where Irishness all stemmed from, and that's where whiteness associated with Irishness. But I think like till this day, like I always wonder, like if you're calling someone racist, like why do they get offended by the term racism, as opposed to like what action did I do to consider myself racist? And it all just stems from that, because it's, you should only be so lucky that you live in Ireland, because your life would be like 10 times worse somewhere else. And again, that like really diminishes and dismisses the lived experiences of people who are going through racism.
Teresa, I think you're on mute there.
Thank you. A year into Zoom and I still don't know how to use it. There was a book that was published some time ago called How Irish Become White. And that tells the story how in US, Irish, Eastern European, Italian, Spaniards, they were all categorized as the lower class subcategory of people. But then the moment immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, from South America started arriving, those people, Europeans, they were elevated to the positions of white people, and then the next group of people took their place. And then again, you know, new waves of immigrants are coming, and then they are elevating the older groups of immigrants, and they are staying on the bottom. But the division, you know, against skin color is very, very distinctive. But I also wanted to kind of mention, again, come back to the theme of telling our stories, and who is holding the power and makes the decision which stories make to the public debate and which stories are being hidden. And that's what Sandrine mentioned at the very beginning, that, you know, we all, you know, everyone was taking pictures with Black Lives Matter posters and everyone was so happy. But, you know, I was talking to the traveling communities, they felt betrayed and they felt really bitter about the situation, that there is such a collective support for this particular issue, whereas they've been experiencing the same trauma for generations and nobody is talking about that. And that's because, you know, and they have the right to kind of challenge this status quo. Why are we talking only about this racism and we are not talking about the racism that is affecting us? And that's because there are other people who hold the power and they make decisions which stories are making to the public and which stories are not, and which stories are being hidden. I had a similar conversation with, you know, that was before the anti-Asian races started due to COVID. They were again saying like they feel that sometimes when they are reaching out for support, they are not being taken seriously because they are from Asia and they are not Black, and people are not offering them support. And again, they feel that bitterness, that the racism that they experience is not being talked about. And I think, you know, when we're talking about stories of racism, we need to remember that we experience racism in different ways. We all have our own stories. It's not a contest who has most upsetting story. And we should make space for all experiences. Like my experience as a white woman, I know it's better. I know that I don't get as much harassment as people who are visibly, you know, diverse. But my experience is not of an Irish person either. I'd also have experiences of racism and discrimination. And, you know, and I would like to feel safe enough to be telling this story without other people undermining me, either saying, oh, that's not bad enough, you know, make space for other people. And I also think about those situations when we are kind of challenging people, we're expecting performative diversity. I was talking to that woman recently who is of a mixed heritage. Her mom is British and her dad is from Jamaica, but she inherited mostly looks from her mom. And when she talks about racism with a British accent, people are saying what that white woman has to say about racism. But the thing is, like, we have to understand that she also has an experience because her father is from Jamaica, and as a child, she was, you know, when she was walking with her father, holding his hand, she received a lot of harassment. So I think it also we need to kind of again think about how we're talking about racism in our context in Ireland, within the sector, actually the anti-racist sector, how we also talking about those issues, and where and how we teaching about racism. Because yeah, I think the biggest success of anti-racist movement so far was that we all know that being racist is bad and we take offense when people call us, but we still act in a racist way and we don't really challenge that.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I do think that we all need to use our voices and, again, not be afraid to speak up and not compare ourselves when it comes to racism, because any type of racism is still racism at the end of the day. And we need to acknowledge that it's not all right, it's not okay. Just because, again, just because if you have Pakistani neighbors or African neighbors, anyone, and if you hate the others, it doesn't, you're contradicting yourself. You know, it's just, we need to educate ourselves more. We need to be open to discussion and take action. I'm just conscious of the time at the moment, so I'm just gonna check if we have any questions. And it looks like we have a question for Sandrine. How can we educate others and ourselves on this topic?
Yeah, I think education, like I don't know if it's just because I'm still in college that I'm just preaching about it, but I think like that's literally always the first place to start. And like I always say, like there's nothing wrong with asking a question, but like you have to, again, like move away from being offended when someone calls you out. Like it's easier for them, like if someone calls you out, to be like, okay, why is it that I say that? And then just go and either read about it, find information about it. But like again, like in Ireland, like we've really been talking about racism, so there's so many free resources out there to go and read about it. And I think that's just all that we can do. It's like if you are in a room and someone is making a racist joke, like instead of laughing with them and being a bystander, because again, that's just as bad, it's why not educate them by even just being like, would you say that if a white person was here? Or why would you say that? Like that's a form of education, because you're just making someone think about what they're saying just before, just instead of just sitting there and being quiet about it. So like education can just happen in so many different ways. But I think for me, just again, it depends on like whether or not you like literature, but I just think it's always reading from voices from different perspective and moving away from just reading white voices and reading Western voices. Because like even in Ireland, like I can think of like I'm a literature student and I've just done Irish history, and like, you know, I did English and history and everything like that. And it wasn't until I was in my final year of college where I discovered African literature. And again, like that's something that you're only taught as an elective when you're finishing. So by being there and just reading different things, and in Ireland, like there's so many new educational and poems and everything like that from minority voices. So only by reading them, then you can start understanding how, again, just even things like Irish identity has changed, and then you can start educating people. But again, just the simplest thing to do is just always ask someone when you don't agree with them, like, why would you say that? And that's a form of education as well.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. I 100% agree with you. Reading is one of the many ways we can educate ourselves, asking questions, being able, again, using our voices. I think it's a very, very important thing. I'm just seeing any other questions. We have a question here for Teresa. Has there been any positive developments and changes that you have noticed?
Definitely, yes. So, you know, I've been working for the Immigrant Council for 8 years, and thanks to the Black Lives Matter, for the very first time last year, we had a discussion about racism in the parliament. When I started working in this area, whenever we were going to talk to civil servants, members of the government, the first question was always, is racism really an issue in Ireland? And I think we finally arrived in 2020 at a point where most of people do agree that racism is in Ireland. And slowly things are changing. I would like the pace of change happen much faster, but at the same time, the change also happens in the opposite directions, in the negative way. Ireland is also receiving backlashes of all the movements, right-wing neo-Nazi movements that are happening in Europe. We are also having extreme right-wing movements starting in Ireland. When the Brexit campaign was happening, when Trump was campaigning for the very first time, numbers of racist incidents increased in Ireland. So things are changing on both ways. And I think we are in a very important moment right now when we need to decide which way we want to go and which way we want to support. And I'm hoping that we can put together efforts, collective efforts, and then choose the way of equality and human rights as opposed to division and hostility.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I think that's very eye-opening what you said. And I definitely on board with it. I think we need to come to a decision which side we want to support and take action and go out and actually achieve our goal at the end of the day, because this has been around for way too long, you know. We have a question here for Dr. Thamel. What has inspired you to speak about this topic?
What has inspired me? That's a interesting one. I think my father was always a guiding principle in my life. I would consider him a principle in my life. He was one of the greatest leaders of the Tamil liberation movement in Sri Lanka. He was in prison for 7 years. He was, a famous speaker for the Tamils and the liberation fighter. But he was a civil engineer by profession. And in this regard, he had one, if I may, to explain and answer this question, he had this one project many years ago, 30, 40 years ago. My father, has died in 2003. But he had this one project somewhere in the rural areas of the Sinhalese, the majority in Sri Lanka. And he took one of his cigarette breaks. Okay, he took a cigarette break. He was a chain smoker. And he went out and he saw, and this was in the middle of the jungle in Sri Lanka, in Maskelia is the area called. And he saw this old Sinhalese lady, so a lady who belonged to the majority in Sri Lanka, washing her grandchild just by the river. And this grandchild was making noises and, was yelling and was not very comfortable that the grandmother was washing it. And she hit that child and she said to that child, "Don't make troubles to me like the Tamils do." And my father told me the story when I grew up, and he didn't tell me the story because I should hate the Sinhalese. He said, this is what happens. We teach the next generation to hate each other. We tell the other one is different and the other one is bad. So I always wondered to myself, why my father entered politics, in face of discrimination and oppression. And he gave a very simple answer. He came from a privileged background and ended up in jail then eventually, as I said. And he gave me a very simple sentence. He said, "Son, there are certain moments in life you have to do the right thing." And I think that is what became then my lived applied experience, that if you see injustice, you speak up. And you speak up against injustice in any way possible. And probably also eventually for that reason, I took up law as a profession in order to use that to fight and speak up for global justice. I hope that answers the question, perhaps.
Oh yeah, it does. Thank you very much. I think that's very inspiring, and I do agree that because of the actions of the past generations, we do end up teaching people to hate each other instead of it's because of the past generations that's some cases where hatred is just rooted into your heart, you know. So we really have to focus on the present and the future, as that's what we are going to deal with, and we have to find ways where we can accept each other and just treat each other with the respect that we all deserve as human beings at the end of the day. Again, I'm a little conscious on time, so I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. We have a question here for Teresa again. What advice would you give to create a positive change on this matter?
Allyship. I think what's very important is to speak up when you see something is happening. And I tell you why this is important. This is important to challenge people who are expressing and acting on racist behavior, that this type of behavior is not acceptable and will not be acceptable in the society. And the more people will speak up against that, the more that message of not accepting racism will be more present in Ireland. But this is also very important from the perspective of a person who was attacked and abused, because racially abused. Because when somebody is being racially harassed or abused and nobody says anything, that person is getting another layer of trauma, because that person thinks that they are not important, what happened to them is not important, that nobody cares about that society agrees with the perpetrators. And the level of trauma is much deeper. So we need to speak up for other people. And it's not, and so people can start the healing process. And also we will challenge the negative sentiments in the society. And it's not about maybe having an impact on a broad scale. Let's start from small steps. Let's start from having those conversations with our families, friends. As Sandrine said, if somebody makes a stupid racist jokes, tell them that's a stupid racist joke. If somebody says something that is hurtful, tell them that it's hurtful. And have those conversations with people around you, and that's how we're gonna then spread out the positive message.
Thank you, Teresa. I think, again, very, very important points you made, and I do agree with you. I think it is very important to be able to, again, speak up, because even for myself, people would make jokes about say things like curry muncher and all this ridiculous things, thinking they're making a laugh and having fun, and it's just rude. And my mother also told me to fight for what is right. So one day I just had enough, and I told them, how would you feel if I said the same to you? So it's very important, I do agree, to speak up and just use the voice you have, because you are human. You should fight for what you believe that is right, and inspire others to do the same. Again, I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. We have one more here for Sandrine. What steps can we take to correct these issues and prevent racism today?
Yeah, I think the most viable step, as Teresa said, is through allyship. So I think it's through that, but just engaging in healthy dialogue. So again, I think we're in this time where there's cancel culture is very big. So when people do ask a question, then straight away they're canceled. So I think just engaging in these dialogues, and again, just going back to the basis of just asking, like, what is racism and what are the implications, and just understanding and how racism can affect more than just Black people. I think that's just the best way to really look at it. So just by moving beyond that, just engaging with different conversation, and just as Teresa said, just through allyship and just not being a bystander, because I think that's how it's been going for so long, because again, it's just been something that has just been ingrained within the Irish society, where we just see it as part of the crack culture. Like, if you say anything about it, you're too sensitive or you're too this. So just moving away from that, and again, just engaging these healthy dialogues, but also calling people out when you see them saying something racist. Because again, just because if you call them out and it's like, oh, I don't want to be called like soft or this, all those connotations that are used to it, just know that you're helping someone out, because as Teresa said, there's more trauma there when you do experience it and everyone else is watching and no one says something. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. If anyone else has any comments to make, please feel free to go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, I mean, about the changes. There was one thing I wanted to mention. I mean, at the university level, I can speak for, the UK universities. Nottingham, for example, they've started to, initiate something that is decolonizing the curriculum and, introduce scholarship to diversify, and that picks up on what Sandrine said there earlier, to diversify the curriculum, to introduce scholarship from different people, and their scholarship, which is called the critical race theory, and then my own scholarship, the third world approaches international law, in order to diversify the narratives, to include subaltern voices. And I think, starting with that already, educating people that there are much more narratives that are attached to education, but then also confronting, as Teresa and Sandra mentioned as well. I mean, at the end of the day, it's, as Martin Luther King said, he said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think it's like a long journey that we have to go, and a long reparatory journey, but eventually it will turn towards justice, and we have to find our allyship, as Teresa said, in that very justice.
Thank you, Dr. Tamil. I do agree. Again, some very valuable points you made there. Does anyone else have any further comments? Okay, no, great. I would really sincerely want to thank each and every one of you for joining us here today, as well as the audience for listening in. I really appreciate it. As part of our dialogue, we would, on behalf of our dialogue, in other words, we would love to thank you, and I am very happy to have you guys here today, this evening. I hope each and every one of you have a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, really, and thank you very